Welcome back. This is our fourth podcast. The podcast is called Strategy to Action. Our guest is Dr. Demming. And Keita, thanks for being with us again. We appreciate your time and your contribution. Getting some good feedback on the first three podcasts where we focused on balancing business and personal life. We also spoke about how one identifies what is a strategy, an effective strategy, the importance of conversation in the workplace, lateral conversations, not necessarily top-down conversations, and of course, prioritizing conversations in your organization and how all of those contribute to a more innovative and a more productive and successful organization. Today, we want to push the envelope a bit further on. And the last time we dealt with prioritizing conversations in the organization. Today, we want to deal with client and staff pain points and addressing those challenges. And the term pain points has come more into the mainstream in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of very different kinds of dimensions. What is a pain point in the context of a client or an employee in the organization?
So I think there's the two different sides of the coin. One is the client and one is the employee. I'm going to say something that might sound radical, but I think one of the clients a lot of companies don't take into account are their employees. So they treat their employees as people who come to work for them and not people who are engaged in helping to serve the client. So there are lots of sort of cliche things about my most important client is my employees. Or if I treat my employees well, they will treat my clients well. And I think there's a real conversation to have around the frustrations that people might feel in the company saying, hey, if we do these three things, I think we can better serve our clients. And yet management or leadership is not listening to me or listening to us. And we think that we can do these things. What eventually happens in that situation is people become disengaged, disenfranchised, and now they're just showing up. So when I come to work, I choose to give you my time, energy, creativity, and intelligence. More and more it happens that I say to you, hey, I've showed up and I've given you these ideas that I think help make our product or service better, and you don't listen to me. All you end up getting is my time. I clock in at 8 and I leave at 5. You do not get my energy, creativity, and intelligence. So there's a pain point there where there are people who want to contribute to a company, and for various reasons, whether it's ego, whether it's time scarcity, whatever it is, they are not engaged in a way that's meaningful and helps to build the organization in a truly innovative and dynamic way. So that's
Is it a pain point for the employee or the employer or both? And how do we identify the difference?
I think it's a pain point for both, because one of the things that I'm trying to get people to understand is that all of these things are bi-directional. So, Paul, if I have a conversation, I can have this conversation with me. A conversation involves two people. If I disengage from the conversation, I just decide, hey, I'm just going to let Paul win this argument and I'm going to make him look good because he never listens to me anyway. I can make that choice. We can still have a conversation. We can have these podcasts. Or we can have a conversation like the ones we've been having where I tell you some of the things that we do in the organizations with which we work. And you then engage me in a real meaningful way, which is often generative. What that means is that it makes me come up with even more creative and better ideas, or even push some of my thinking. So I think it's really important for us to be very clear on those kinds of things. So the pain point is not, it's a both and in that situation.
Well, very often, what are pain points identified as pain points for employees? Because there's no effective conversation going on, productive conversation going on. The employer just dismisses it as griping or employees wanting to challenge the authority of the organization or the hierarchy of the organization. And the pain points are not acknowledged and or dealt with. How can companies get past that? I know it's caught up in the conversation, but what are the first steps in remedying those sorts of situations?
So it always depends on the scale of the conversation. So I'll say So, for example, just because it's top of mind and it's something that's happening globally right now. Um, right now in the UK, you have this post office scandal thing that's happening. You have Boeing that's going through some issues, and you have in the Caribbean, you have Massey that's going through some issues around employees feeling not heard. Right. So those are three international examples that I can think of right away. Um, there's a piece around that that's a governance issue of how do we set up the organization so that there's less nepotism, there's true engagement with employees, etc. So I think there's a piece around that. And then if I go more micro, down from the governance side, there's a team dynamics piece that I think is often missed. And then the research right now is very focused on what we call psychological safety. So it's very focused on high performing teams create psychological safety, and this stems from the Aristotle project that Google did that found that for all their teams, the most important thing that predicted a high performing team was whether or not there was psychological safety present or not. And as a result of that, there's been all this stuff that's um, come out of that. My favorite author around that, a person who's made that most clear, is a guy called Stephen Shibletsky. And he wrote a book called Speak Up. And the things that he points out is that if you want to create a high performing organization, you have to make it safe and worth it for people to want to speak up. That's the two things you have to do. So I have a client right now who, when I was working with his team, the team said that there are two things that happen to us. We will speak up, but we know it will not matter. And then another group of people say, it's not worth it to speak up, so I don't say anything. And then, not in my client's case, but in a third situation, what often happens is people say, the stakes are too high for me not to say something. I have to speak up. In an ideal situation, you live in the fourth box, which is it's safe and worth it for me to speak up, challenge, and share what I think are the best and brightest ideas that we need to move forward with as an organization. So that's in the team dynamics level. But then at a much higher level, I think there's a governance issue that often gets overlooked. And I'm not a governance person, so I'm not going to talk about governance a lot. But I think those are the two issues that people often um, overlook. And actually, let me simplify that. There are four components that run your business and determine whether or not your organization is strong: strategy, structure, systems and processes, and financial management. Once you determine your strategy, you next have to figure out what's the structure of the organization. The structure of the organization is things like governance, team structure, team building, etc. What are the systems and processes in that building? And then that leads to financial management. There are two things that run through all four of those things, which is how you deal with people and how do you cultivate a culture. So if you cultivate a culture that's around conversations and around psychological safety, around a speaker culture, you get way more innovation happening. My experience working in the Caribbean is that you don't get a lot of speaker culture. It's do as I say because I said so. That's the culture. I know better than you. That's
Well, I'm
culture.
glad you brought up the Massey issue, which is in the public domain. What should Massey and companies looking on learn from that? It happened at a really high level. It happened at an AGM, but there were antecedents to it in which, from what is in the public domain, a senior vice president brought some concerns uh, to the leadership, which, in her opinion, were not dealt with. So there was clearly a lack of a fluid conversation going on. So she brought it up at an open forum, which led to some significant consequences for the organization as a whole and also for principals inside of the organization. What is the lesson in that for Massey, one, and for other organizations, both large as a conglomerate and smaller companies?
Yeah, so let's talk. Massey is the same issue that's happening in the post office. It's the same issue that's happening in Boeing. It, it's the same kind of issues that are happening, which is an employee comes to you and says, "Hey, I have some concerns about the viability of what we're doing. I'm laying them out for you. How are you going to respond to that?" When they don't respond, in the case of Boeing, planes fall out of the sky. That is what is happening. in that culture in particular, you have people who are saying, we have these targets, we have to meet these targets at all costs. And then people are saying, wait, slow down. There are some safety concerns that I think we need to look out for. If we deal with those safety concerns now, we're going to miss our deadlines. Therefore, let's proceed. Those you need to have spaces where people can say, hey, we need to stop and we need to rethink those deadlines. But what often happens, it comes from top down. And that's something that happens whether you're Wells Fargo is another good example. Wells Fargo had this whole situation where they were selling people financial products they didn't need. And it was all based on a metrics kind of approach. And people were speaking up. This is unethical. This is taking people into bankruptcy, all of these kind of things. But because it was driven by the money, it was very hard to get people to listen to that. So the solution to that is psychological safety, which has become that piece of it, is that we have to have spaces where people have real dialogue and real conversations, and it's listened to and responded to in a way that is not this like ego piece, but it's like, hey, you know what, leadership, we made a mistake here. We need to recalibrate, or we risk bringing down the entire organization. And I think one of the things that happens with these big companies in particular is that it's a sort of too big to fail kind of approach. And there are lots of examples of companies who've fallen, not because the canaries in the mine weren't singing, but it was because nobody listened to the canaries. So I think the number one thing is, if the canary starts singing, start to get out of the mine, start to think there's a gas leak somewhere, right? And I that's the number one thing that I think people have to have. I really believe organizations today need to double down on conversational skills. We need to double down on how do we teach people to have conflict? How do we teach people to have deeper conversations? How do we teach people to have brainstorming in a way that's effective? Because most brainstorming approaches don't work. But like, how do we teach people to have these conversations that drive revenue and measurable results? That'd be where I would start. And I think there's a piece around that that's at a governance level, and I think there's a piece around that that's a team level.
But you say too big to fail. Is it got so big that we stop talking? We stop having those conversations because we've attained a significant level of success. So in our minds, and I know in the earlier podcast, we defined what success could mean different things to different people in different organizations. But to many organizations, of course, the bottom line is profit line and shareholder interests, etc., and product superiority and competitiveness. But when you get to that stage, for example, Apple is another company that's going through some trial now because, again, not listening, not looking at what's happening on the ground, not listening to the customer, not seeking the interest of the customer as opposed to profits. We're seeing it over and over with very big companies because, as you said, they seem too big to fail, but isn't that they've gotten so big they stop having those conversations or listening?
So I just want to point out a stat to listeners that most people may not know. I think it's something like less than 2% of companies that have ever existed have lasted more than 40 years. I think it's something crazy like that, where it's for a company to last 40 years is nothing short of a miracle. It's very hard for a company to be around for more than 40 years. So I think what you have to recognize is that as a company, the longer that I'm successful, the closer I'm coming to collapse or failure. Now that's a very different perspective
Why
because
is that? Product life cycle, general company life cycle, changing
general company
environment.
life cycle, changing technology, changing times. I'll use Netflix as an example. Netflix has essentially been the same brand, three different companies. The first company used to mail DVDs to you, used to mail it back, and the whole point was like, let's get rid of late fees. The second company was a streaming company. That's now, instead of you having to like walk to the post office and mail the DVDs, you're going to stream it. They leverage that sort of YouTube technology and can stream movies. Today, they're essentially a production company. They're making their own movies, right? Same brand, but they've evolved. The classic cases we talk about are things like Kodak, Nokia, all those companies that existed. They had innovations within their ecosystem, but they didn't
BlackBerry.
capitalize or use them. So all I'm saying is that the market is going to change, period. Let's like today we're in the age of AI. There are so many companies that are going to die because of that new technology that's coming. But most companies are not going to last more than 40 years. And I think the older you are, the more, I'm trying not to use this word, but the more paranoid you need to be that you're closer to failure than further from failure. So let's use another example in the Caribbean. Clico is a classic example of they were not doing the basic things in terms of investments. And that's why they failed. And it was driven by people who were inside making a certain amount of money. It wasn't driven by the basics of finance. It wasn't driven by the basics of transparency, etc. So I think you have to I think we have to remember that it's the larger you are, the closer you are to that failure point. And I don't think people recognize that. And while you're in abundance and while you have money, it's hard to see that. Really, really hard to see. It's easy to point it in hindsight. But nobody's too big to fail, which is why I think you have to double down on the basics. Like, how do we have a good meeting? At the end of this meeting, we created some kind of new innovation. That's a conversation. A meeting is a form of a conversation.
You mentioned a while ago the issue of embracing conflict. You didn't put it like that, but I'm putting it like that. And dealing and devising productive mechanisms to deal with conflict in a conversation. Because differences of opinion and differences in approach and differences in perspective will arise with human beings. How is that done effectively? What's the approach to be taken with that? Because most people tend to try to avoid conflict at all costs.
Yeah. So the most basic way to answer that question is you focus on the ideas and you don't focus on the people. So you don't make it personal. So if you and I are having a debate about whether we go for Chinese food or we go for
Italian.
Italian, you and I don't then go and say Paul is an idiot. He never listens. Da da da. Like once I go down that road, I'm now starting to attack Paul. Let's keep the conversation about food. Like, what is it about Italian that you want? I just want somewhere where I can sit down and chat and it's not noisy. Oh, okay, that's good. That's what's important to you. It's not Italian. It's at the Italian restaurant you're thinking of. You can sit down and eat, etc. But what's important to me is I want something that's quick. Now we might end up at like El Pecos, which is for people in the Caribbean. It's a thing in Trinidad. It's not loud. It's fast. And now we introduced a third option because what was really important to you was a place where we could talk and speak, right? So the conflict is about getting to what do people really care about and having the skills to have a conversation about what is actually important to the person in that conversation without attacking them, without making it personal and saying, what do you care about? Another really great skill, which I think I mentioned in a previous um, podcast, was um, my wife and I use this thing. If we're having a conflict and we're not getting far, we say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you care about this? 10 being you care about it a lot, 0 being the opposite. How much do you care about it? She'll say a 7. Well, I'm a 2, so you win. Right? Like that, like
Yeah, but you are two people who understand each other and have different personalities that probably understand each other. That may not necessarily work for all couples because
oh, I mean,
suppose both say this means an 8 to me. It means an 8 to me too.
right.
Because they have underlying issues that they're competing, they're not coexisting properly.
But here's what I'm willing to bet. 9 out of 10 times, it's not an 8. Both of you care about it an 8. Most times, one person cares an 8 and one person cares a 3. That's what happens most times. Any times where it's both of you care about it a lot, now we can have a real conversation about it. What I'm saying is that often some of the conflicts we're having, we're talking about, we get into this pattern of conflict or fighting, and it's not even something I really care about. Right? It's not even, let's say
It's not even that important.
it's not even that important to me.
Which speaks to it's a deeper issue. It's
Yeah,
not the concept we have. It's not about what we're talking about per se, but it's how you perceive me, how I perceive you, and what we feel about particular issues.
but that's why I gave the example of Italian versus Chinese, and then we end up at like Creole food. Let's call it Creole food if that's what we call it. El Pecos. Funny story. My wife is Canadian, and I said to her, she was in Trinidad. I'm like, hey, let's go for El Pecos. When we walk into El Pecos, she was so disappointed that El Pecos was not Mexican. If you go to Trinidad, you'll understand.
It's Mexican, but it's
It is not Mexican in Trinidad. It is like full on Trini food.
Real
You will
food.
get all kind of food. But that's funny. But my point is, when you focus on what people really want, what people really care about, you can introduce a third option that satisfies both of you. That's why I use that example. I use the example of what is actually important to you. So one is speed, the other one is like a place where we can actually talk and listen to. Okay, now let's look for a place that is both fast and somewhere we can talk to. Now that's a whole different conversation. You have to have the skills to do that. And that's why the scaling question, I like the scaling question a lot because, oh, this is something you and I both care about. Now let's talk about why we care about that. It's something that's important to us. I didn't know that you cared about this prior to me giving you that scaling question. You didn't know that was important to me, right? So things like that, I think, and it could be simple things. I have a couple in my world who they're having a big fight about, consistent fight about whether or not their kids go to private or public school. This is a massive debate that they're having. I think they're not getting any closer to the solution. One person is going to win this because of the power dynamic.
Mhm.
But in the process of them having a conversation about private versus public school, they're learning about values that they didn't know their partner care about. They didn't realize that, oh, it's really important to me that our kids are surrounded by people from all demographics of life. I hate the idea that our son or daughter would be in school with only people who have privilege. That's not a conversation they ever had. Now they can have those conversations. Now they're thinking about different ways to introduce that in their life. Let's say they decide to go the private school route. So conversations are these like this thing that we use every single day. That is a real tool for us to have deep, meaningful insights about each other, and we ignore them at our panel in organizations all the time and our real worlds.
It brings to mind an example. One of my professors would say the iceberg theory of having a discussion. You start with the tip, which is the obvious, visible part. But the more you have the conversation, the deeper level you go in terms of understanding the size of the issue you're dealing with and the elements of the issues you're dealing with.
One of the things I like to say, my brother's a free diver, so he catches fish with like free diving, and he talks about how you don't catch big fish in shallow water, you catch big fish in deep water, and I think it's the same about conversations. If you want to have big innovation, big insights, meaningful friendships and relationships, you have to go deep. It's very easy for us to stay on the surface and talk about these shallow things. There are people I know for 15 years and I don't know anything about it.
Mhm.
People I know for a year and we've had these deep, meaningful conversations where I learned all this stuff about them and I have way more of a connection with the person I know for a year than the person I know 15 years, and that's because we went deep.
In our final moments, I want to go back to the issues of pain points for organizations now and clients. And two of the examples I want to bring, I don't know how familiar you are with them, which happened recently in Trinidad, is one regarding the ability of companies to listen to their clients and identify their clients' pain points. One is Pennywise Chain, where they put out a release where there's an issue with um, minimum wage, and some of the employees were affected by that. And the response from their customers, interestingly enough, sought to me protect the employees because they have such a good relationship with the employees. And that company responded very, very quickly in 1 or 2 days to what the customer was telling about their move with the employees versus another company, big fast food brand in Trinidad and Tobago, we all know it, popular brand, which suffered some issues because they raised their prices for the same minimum wage issue, didn't listen for a while, and saw people avoiding I don't want to say boycotting, but avoiding the franchise and using alternative and using empty drive-throughs, etc. And it just goes to show how the same conversation you're having about companies that are listening to employees and listening to clients and are able to respond because they're listening effectively or they're having a conversation effectively.
Well, here's the thing about that. I think more and more you're going to see that happening in the world. So I think 30 years ago, you could make decisions in an ivory tower and push them through, etc. In today's world where you have social media, there's a whole conversation that's happening that if companies are not paying attention to what's happening on their social media channels, they're not connected to their end users at all. They're not connected to their clients. And the thing that I think is really important about that is that you give me an example where the customers went to bat for the employees. And you should never have a situation where the the customers are having more of a fight for your employees than you are as a company. So I think that's an interesting piece there that you bring up around that it was the customers who put more pressure on the company to do something for the employees.
And on the other hand, where there didn't seem to be an attention being paid to what the clients were saying, and the company started to lose ground because again, there's no mechanism for feedback in terms of that customer client relationship.
Yeah. So let's take this back a little bit further. So let's talk about strategy, right? So in strategy, the bottom line of strategy is thinking about two things: where you're going to allocate resources, and what approach is likely to help you win in the marketplace or whatever you've chosen to play, whatever field you've chosen to play. In that situation, there are usually different stakeholders that you need to pay attention to. People don't often pay attention to the communities in which people work in, the employees, and the end users. Most times, all they care about is the shareholders in general. We are in a world now where if you focus on your shareholders only, you are going to be in trouble. Today's world, you have to focus on all of the stakeholders that are involved in the organization. That's what this push around ESG and things like that, or social entrepreneurship or anything like that, those are code words for how are you paying attention to all of the stakeholders in your network and not just shareholders. And I think there's more of a move towards that people may be missing, and they may not be realizing that included in your strategy or however you're approaching your business has to be shareholders, employees, the communities in which the employees live, the people you serve or your end users, and the suppliers that you're working with. Those are the 5 classic stakeholders involved in any business, but we tend to ignore that. We don't tend to see that. And your example with Pennywise is a good example of that, where you have 2 different stakeholders advocating for each other, right? And you're going to see more on that. Sorry?
Both equally important in terms of being listened to.
Exactly. But you're going to see more of that because of this social media world we're living in, where I could be working for a company and just take my phone and say, these are the conditions I'm working in. I post that online and boom, done. You know, have a PR scandal on there. I was in a meeting today and somebody spoke to me in this way and I didn't feel brave enough to think. I quit. Here's why I'm quitting. Boom, I put that on social media. Another one, that happened to me 2 years ago. That happened to me 3 years ago. That company's been like that. Boom, now you're in a PR cycle. So this whole idea around really being able to have better conversations in companies is going to become more of a risk factor that I think people are underestimating. And its ugly head is already showing in all kinds of ways that the way of doing business is changing and it will continue to change.